Welcome. My name is Jeff Strickland. I'm a history professor at Montclair State University. And the session is Equatorial Guinea in Historical Perspective. We have four papers, four excellent papers, written by scholars from around the world. The first paper is written by titled Wakoba Abe, Wakoba Politique, 3 Decades of Social Paralysis and Political Immobility in Equatorial Guinea. Ibrahim K. Sundiata from Brandeis University will present a paper, Black and or Spanish, Bioko and the Caribbean in Historical Perspective. Jeremy Rich from Middle Tennessee State University will present Nous les Esquatos, Experiences of Equatorial Guinea, Guinean Immigrants in Contemporary Gabon. And finally, Gerhard Sebert from CEA ISCTE Portugal will present a paper, Equatorial Guinea's External Relations, Sao Tome e Principe, and the CPLP. Each paper will last 20 minutes. Ask you to line up behind the microphone in the center aisle here in the middle of the room and ask your questions from there. And please, we also ask that you make those questions specific and to the point, perhaps even addressing the particular scholar. So, Enrique Akenve, please.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I was told, or I was asked to give the questions, whether they are in English or in Spanish. I'll be willing to take them and answer them as best as I can. All right. The first thing I want to do is to express gratitude to the organizers of the conference, and especially Benita San Pedro. When I started doing research on Equatorial Guinea just a few years ago, I could have an occasion like this would have been unthinkable, and I'm very happy to be here. The idea of this paper, Wakoba Abe, Wakoba Politique, 3 Decades of Social Paralysis and Political Immobility in Equatorial Guinea. The idea of this paper was born more than 6 years ago, while I was doing fieldwork for my PhD research. The idea was born 6 years ago, but it hasn't been until just barely a month ago that I have written this paper. And I'm very happy that this conference finally pushed me to write this, to put these ideas into comfortable with the past and that I do with the present, but that was the idea, to explain political situation and conditions in Equatorial Guinea. I didn't want to write a very academic paper. I wanted to write a paper that was understandable by many, but yet I wanted the paper to be rigorous, because that's a problem. The lack of rigor is a problem that we suffer in Equatorial Guinea. There's always frequently many rumors, but very few facts or rigor, if you like. So what is it that I was trying to explain in this paper? The main idea was that, okay, we are about to commemorate 30 years since Obiangema has been in power. And based on my observations, the idea that I wanted to, the main thing that I wanted to explain is how these 30 years of power have organizationally a weak regime, and yet the regime has managed to stay in power for 3 decades. we can consider this a form of political stability. Political stability, which is, as we know, uncommon in the African continent. So we might argue that Equatorial Guinea is an exception. Although for those of us who are familiar with the area in which Equatorial Guinea is located, we know that political stability is actually more the norm than the exception. Cameroon, Gabon, they all have long-standing regimes. And so I'm trying to explain these 30 years of power, but at the same time, one of the questions is like, how has this been possible? Because in my view, there's a large level of dissatisfaction with the political, economic, and social conditions in the country. This is you must understand that this is very subjective. But this, as you must understand, because of the political situation in Equatorial Guinea, it is very difficult to obtain objective data on this. So the explanation that I came up with to how a weak regime has managed to stay in power for so long is the idea that the society has developed a political culture of societal self-repression. That is, the society in many ways is repressing itself, and that is helping out the regime. This societal self-repression is what leads or helps to or leads to social paralysis and political immobility in the country. So, wako politique can be translated as, in English, you are bad-mouthing, you are talking politics. I'm going to try to explain what this means. Before And I will be referring to the two rulers, the two presidents of that Equatorial Guinea has had since independence by the fang names, Massim Ngema and Obiang Ngema. And I will probably use Guinea and Guineans instead of Equatorial Guinea and Equatorial Guineans to refer to the country and the peoples of the country. All right. So societal self-repression should help us understand these 3 decades of stability, in inverted commas, in Equatorial Guinea. But the first thing I wanted to try to examine is if this societal self-repression, this political culture, is part of the historical political culture in the region. And what I came up with is that, no, that wasn't the case. Pre-colonial political culture was very different. It was very different in the sense that self-repression was not part of the historical political culture. Of power. Those leaders who, in the late 19th century, were able to participate in the increasing coastal trade with the Europeans, still find it very difficult to consolidate their economic power into political power. And so political culture of self-repression wasn't the case before colonialism. This is not to say that authoritarian tendencies did not exist before colonialism. Authoritarian tendencies existed, and yet I think they were contained to a very large extent. So what happened? How this political culture that prevented the development or undermined political accumulation in Equatorial Guinea has led to this societal as a leviathan, right? Because the colonial state is going to provide the tools to overcome this resistance to accumulation of power. And those strategies that the societies of Equatorial Guinea had developed in order to resist the accumulation of power were overwhelmed by the colonial state, right? And yet, I think we must understand that the colonial state, as powerful as it was a fragile institution. And the fragility of the colonial state, it's going to affect many of the developments after independence. We know that the colonial state was especially developed with regards to its bureaucratic and especially coercive apparatus. But as many historians have claimed, the colonial state was fundamentally an unfinished project. In Equatorial Guinea, it won't be until 1959 were dedicated to strengthen different infrastructures, including the state in Equatorial Guinea. But this was insufficient because by 1968, the country gained independence. In spite of the role of the colonial state as this powerful leviathan, powerful and yet weak leviathan with a strong coercive apparatus, what we see is that during the colonial period, there were still signs of civil society resisting the state. And I mentioned two examples. One is, for example, the refusal of Bube and Fang farmers to become the labor force for the Spanish colonizers to work on the cocoa plantations on Bioko, Fernando Po, if you prefer. This was one example of resistance. The other example is, for example, the development of new social identities. In my PhD dissertation, I explained the result of colonial imposition, and at the same time is an example of resistance to colonialism. And other examples, less traditional, if you prefer, examples of resistance to the state, is the emergence of nationalism in Guinea, in Equatorial Guinea, right? The nationalist challenge to the state is an example of a modern form of political culture, right? Modern, if you like, what I mean by modern, inspired in many of the instruments and ideas developed in Europe since the early 19th century, right, that allow the mobilization of society and to put resistance to the state, to offer some kind of resistance to the state. And the nationalist movement, one of the problems that I think one of the problems that it had and it has had in the history of Equatorial Guinea is that the nationalist movement we can characterize it as an elitist movement, meaning that it is a minority of the society who are actually involved in the nationalist struggle. And it's also an immature movement because it pretty much was developed in the late 1950s. Within a decade, independence was gained. So it didn't carry on. It didn't have to experience a long struggle like cases like, for example, South Africa, where we have a much longer struggle movement. These are the conditions then lead to independence and the post-colonial state that the African rulers, Mr. Mengema in particular, first is going to inherit. And one of the things that we need to think about the colonial state is that, the post-colonial state is that although theoretically the African post-colonial state is inspired by the metropolitan or European state, the model to the state, you know. But the state, as weak as it was, it was a very useful instrument because it offered the source of economic power, it provided the source of economic power for those with material ambitions, and also provided the source for political power for those with non-material ambitions, if you prefer. But as Mr. Mengema experienced, the state could be lost if improperly used, and legitimacy can be very fragile. So these are the lessons that somebody like Obiang Nguema, who was close to the Mr. Mengema regime, has, I think, he learned. And he realized that political loyalty, it's very important, it's key in order to maintain control over the state. So I think that his main objective was to maintain control. He appropriated the state assets. And the state assets, at the same time, these state assets offer him the possibility to reward loyalty, right? And in addition to this, what we need to understand is that the type of patrimonialism that we have in Equatorial Guinea is a family type of patrimonialism. That is, it's not a national patrimonialism. This is not patrimonialism of a class, of a region. No, this is the state being appropriated fundamentally by one family. And this also leads to personal loyalty. The one who rewards loyalty is not the state, it's Obiangema. Then it's because that's how we have the type of personal loyalty that we have in Equatorial Guinea. One of the things that he has done very successfully, he has been Obiangema in the 1970s. The loyalty base of Obiangema is much broader. From the Mongomo clan, or the so-called Mongomo clan, or Clan de Mongomo of the early 1980s, now we have moved into this idea of hermano militante, the militant brother of the PDGE, right? And in addition to that, we see that he has developed a clientelist network. And the clientelist network is important because it helps him overcome the limitations of the state. It's a personalist infrastructure that helps him to overcome the limitations of the post-colonial state. At the same time, this clientelist network helps him to counteract this loyalty or lack of loyalty within the country. But this clientelist network must be understood as a pyramidal or concentrical structure. If you are the top, or if you are the center of this structure, you have to express greater loyalty, but the in the paper is the role of ministers of government, who act as links between the state and the people. Let me just read something that was told to me by one informer. This is during August the 3rd, 3 de agosto, 2002, I think, somebody who attended this celebration of the 1979 coup against Messias. These are the words that Obiangema addressed to the crowd. Those who claim that I do not care about you, I will ask you, how many ministers does Mikomesan have? I have given you 3 ministers, and what have they done for you? Nothing. What else can I do? They do not even have a house of their own in Mikomesan. So this is an example of how he sees these ministers as the ones who have to provide for the people in the district. Decade and a half, the Democratic Party of Equatorial Guinea, PDGE in Spanish, has become the main instrument for the mobilization of political rewards and loyalty in Equatorial Guinea. And what we see is that these elements, these members of the clientelist network who help him to maintain power, they are corporate representatives. They represent groups. So they have to look after the interests of the group. And at the same time, this creates one problem, that for most people, one of the objectives or one of the main preoccupations is that nobody should undermine their chances to be rewarded or to have access to the center or top of the clientelist network. So this is a system that helps him to establish a broad loyalty base, and this is a system that helps him to maintain control over the This is not enough. In addition to that, this is not enough. We need to understand that in addition to that repression, it's important to maintain control over over the state. And repression is necessary because of the limitations of the rewards. Not everybody has access to the rewards. And in addition to that, the rewards are not equally valuable for everybody. Because of this, it's necessary to implement violence or it's necessary to the threat of its use, right? So you can control those who are dissatisfied. One of the things that I mentioned in the paper is that repression under Obiangema has been much more effective than it was during the colonial era. And this has a lot to do with the notion of sovereignty. As we know, in most of Africa, because of the idea of sovereignty, sovereignty almost equals legitimacy. And the work helped to implement repression, but also violence is an important mechanism, which is administered fundamentally by the army and the numerous security forces. One of the examples that I mentioned in the paper is that the most effective form of repression is La Seguridad. La Seguridad, and what is La Seguridad in Equatorial Guinea? It's a secret service. We don't really know what this Seguridad is all about. We know that they don't have, whatever they are, they're not effective because of the training or resources. It's mostly because of the fact that they do not wear uniform. It automatically means that anybody is potentially a member of the Seguridad. And this creates distrust within the society. At the same time, we know that violence is arbitrary in the country. Violence is arbitrary, meaning that it's not systematic, it's arbitrary. Victim of violence. So there's uncertainty that leads to this social paralysis. And at the same time, what we have seen is the politicization of society in Equatorial Guinea. Everything is politics. This is why Wako politique makes sense. Anything that you said, any complaint that you express can be characterized as politics, and that's not acceptable. This is a climate that undermines the multi-party politics in Equatorial Guinea. I'm just going to read one page as a conclusion, and that's it. The creation of a monolithic society by the Obiangema regime has been widely consolidated through the unconscious cooperation of the broad Equatorial Guinean society. It is the lack of a modern political consciousness, complementary of the modern state-like, that makes it difficult for Equatorial Guineans to challenge the might of the Obiangema regime. The short-lived nationalist movement never consolidated into a mature the regime had found mechanisms to cope and minimize the influence of political pluralism. Outside the regime, there's no political culture that favors the creation of civic, cultural, or political organizations. Social discontent, therefore, cannot be expressed in an organized and collective manner that can seriously challenge the state. The disarticulation of Equatorial Guinean society is perhaps best illustrated by the fact that social relations inside the country have a very limited local character. People do not move freely inside Equatorial Guinea. The presence of numerous checkpoints across the country's roads are a constant reminder that while one can go almost everywhere, he or she must have a reason to go. As a result, Equatorial Guineans know very little about people outside the immediate setting. Through the political and economic control of society, Obiangema has succeeded in creating a political culture that, to a very large degree, has been internal for economic improvement are greater than ever, but so are the restraints to enjoy the benefits of the economic boom. Given the limitations of Equatorial Guinean society, one is forced to comply with the system in order to have access to the new wealth. Both political and economic pressures result in an almost moral definition of what is politically acceptable and unacceptable in Equatorial Guinea. This is how we can understand the term opositor, oppositionist. This is how we can understand that this term has such a negative connotations in this country. People are classified in two categories, good and bad citizens, that is, supporters and enemies of the established political order. An oppositor is not only somebody likely to bring political and economic misfortune upon himself. More importantly, the oppositor is likely to extend his political and economic misfortune to the rest of the family. This is a fundamental element to understand societal self-repression in Equatorial Guinea. The family, despite the numerous changes are almost unavoidable, given that the person is defined as such in relation to the broader family group. To be an oppositor does not only mean a rejection of the figure of Obiangema, but most importantly, it amounts to betray one's own family. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Hablaré en inglés porque yo no hablo español. I really want to thank the organizers of this great conference, especially Benita. Thank you very much. And I'm very glad to be here. I have actually two papers, but I'm not going to go through the two papers. The two ideas, which Bioko, then Fernando Po, and went to Bioko with some interesting political ramifications a long time ago. And at a meeting at my university about 9 months ago, there was a young professor from Yale who was talking about origins, African origins of people in the African diaspora. And I was sort of sitting there, you know, we go to conferences, you listen, I wasn't dozing off, but listening, and then halfway through her presentation, she said, "Booby." And I thought, well, no one has ever said booby before in my life at a conference, except of, you know, people working with Equatorial Guinea. So she said that she was working with memory and origin of people in the African diaspora. In Great Britain, and that Ms. McCullough had discovered that she is booby, and that many more Black Britons were discovering that they are booby. And of course, I was gratified. Well, I was amazed. This hadn't happened before. And so I actually went out and looked up Ms. McCullough. And so there are questions of memory, there are questions of construction of memory, especially vis-a-vis Equatorial Guinea and Bioko, that more and more people outside would be identifying with a fairly small place, which, according to a UNESCO publication in the 1970s, the glory of the booby is that they never participated in the Atlantic slave trade. So we have from the 1970s UNESCO saying people avoid I am booby. And let me just, what I'm going to do, if I may, is read you, because I cut my paper. I made a mistake in reading my email. I cut my paper down, and since I'm usually long-winded, it will expand. I'm going to quote Ms. McCullough. "The booby are my blood relatives. Through my tears of joy and sadness, I saw and embraced my blood cousin. After some 500 years of separation, I had at last returned to the place from where I came. What would the ancestors make of all this? What would my grandmother think?" Her grandmother's from Kingston, Jamaica. "That night I fell asleep peacefully for the first time since arriving on the island, Bioko. I ate customary foods and I had a ceremonious tola marking a transition. Throughout our lives, marriage, and the funeral. For me, this marking of my hands and feet during the tola ceremony with natural plant henna-like substances and ash symbolized a significant change for me. It meant I had reclaimed the lost heritage. I had acknowledged an acceptance of who I was, a booby woman, my African essence. I returned to the city of Malabo days later with my new hand and feet markings. It was clear I was booby, returning from Mocha. I felt very special, very accepted. I belonged." That's a powerful statement. It goes on. I mean, it's very poetic. Ms. McCullough works with sort of language which is poetical. She endowed a school on Bioko. Separated from for 500 years. And the reason I would like to interview her. In fact, this conference is going to give me the impetus to interview Ms. McCullough, is that she chose Bioko as this ancestral place. It's also a very magical place in her reading, is because she was swabbed with DNA. And the DNA said Bioko, Bubi. Now we're going to get, at the end I'll get back to DNA, what DNA does, doesn't do, can do, and how we use DNA. Now, the other sort of looking at the Bubi is the glory of the Bubi in a lot of writings that I've read is that they didn't participate. The Spanish, the Portuguese, the British tried to use the Portuguese landed on Bioko, visited Bioko, and then left. We think there's fragmentary evidence that the Dutch may have tried to settle in the 1640s. There's an author, Bosman, who writes about the 18th century and says, well, the beginning of the 18th century, and says that Bioko, or Fernando Po, is a place where the people do not wish to engage in trade of any kind. Avoid them, meaning slave trade, any kind of trade. Avoid them. Now, the Spanish came in 1778, but it was ephemeral. The Spanish came as a result of a series of reforms and land changes, exchanges with Portugal and Brazil. So the Portuguese got a little bit more for Brazil, Santa Catarina, and open up a Spanish slave trade. It would be based on Bioko. It would it would be a reform, a liberal reform, because Spain would now actually have its own slave trading post and not deal with the British, the Dutch, or the Portuguese. The Spanish arrived on the island, sailed around the island, sailed around again, landed, and looked for the owners, because they had bought the island in some sense from the Portuguese. There wasn't one Portuguese on the island, only Bubi. So they sailed to São Tomé and complained. A Portuguese returned with them to Luba, Concepcion, and sort of, we actually have the treaty, you know, so this is ours, this belongs to Spain. But malaria and mutiny disrupted this plan. Completely. Now, the Bubi in the 19th century were a very complex population that most outsiders didn't know much about. And even those anthropologists and historians who now work with the Bubi say, you know, I mean, it's like looking at an elephant. The elephant is real. But the complexity of the situation, given the size of Bioko, is astounding. Who are the Bubi, and what do we know of their recent political history? I mean, in the last 150 years. In the early 19th century, the Bubi were divided into 28 districts and contained more than 2,000 inland villages. That's a lot. By the third quarter of the 19th century, a sole high king, Mocha, had emerged. We think at the beginning of the 19th century, the Bubi were 1880, there's definitely one king of the island, Mocha. The question is, how was he able to unite these various political units? Why was he so successful in avoiding the European gaze? We have descriptions of Mocha's palace. We have descriptions of Mocha's organization, but I haven't really found a physical description of Mocha. I know what his house looked like in some detail. I mean, in a word picture. And that Mocha was able to unite a Bantu-speaking people. Bubi is the northwesternmost of the Bantu languages, which stretch all the way to South Africa. And he was able to probably bring together a very disparate population. Now, this is my own interpretation, that there was a Bantu language Bubi is the northwesternmost. But the island, in this complexity with all these political units, and these units fought each other, probably had received waves of by or before the 14th century. And then there probably were scattered migrants, very few from Cameroon. There were some people from Sao Tome, called Portuguese. There were little trickles of people. And that because the slave trade, in most readings, had avoided Bioko, some very exotic sort of escapees. For instance, in 1821, an English ship arrived on Bioko. A man came out to trade for iron and spoke English. And he said he was from Philadelphia. He was an African American. And so the sort of British, it's very interesting, the sort of cultural confusion. The British said, oh my God, you're stranded. We will take you away with us to civilization. And he says, well, you see, I speak Bubi. I have a Bubi wife. Never came back. It's very, why would he want to go with the British? He's got a wife, he's happy. I mean, considering the world of West Africa in 1821, he's got a pretty good deal. But he's probably not just an isolated individual. There probably were other individuals who came, or groups of individuals, who sort of came to Bioko and sort of added to this mix. Now, by the 1820s, the Bubis were competing with each other over palm oil. The Bubi did engage in the palm oil trade, and it was conducted initially in the 1820s by barter. Later it was carried out with shell money that the Bubi used. And so they traded palm oil for iron, which was one of the things. You have people who could smelt iron but didn't have ready sources of iron. And so most of the accounts in the early 19th century say the groups are competing for one of the things that probably led to the emergence of Mocha around 1875 was alien settlement. That Bioko is one of those places, and there's several in the world, which were between empires. The Bubi, I would argue, were independent until the late 19th century, or maybe the beginning of the 20th century. In theory, the question was, well, who did Bioko belong to? And I'll argue, well, it belonged to itself. It had these completely competing sort of layers of complexity throughout most of the 19th century, and was not really part of the Spanish colonial empire. In 1827, the British landed and saw Bioko as the key. It was argued in several books, very famous books, that Bioko was the control the palm oil trade, and at the same time, and cheaply, stop the Atlantic slave trade. Slaves were coming out of Calabar, et cetera, in great numbers, and Bioko is very close. So the British landed in 1827 and began this base, but then they realized they didn't own it, and so what they did is they sent a letter to the owners. They sent a letter to Lisbon, thinking the Portuguese owned it, and the Portuguese said, well, we'll sell it to you. Now, there's no Portuguese person on Bioko. After some months, the Portuguese said, oh, sorry. In the 1770s, we traded that to the Spanish. So a letter goes to the Spanish, and then at which point the British say no and leave. They leave behind Sierra Leoneans and Kru laborers, and these groups then invade Bubi territory, fight with Bubi, and it's probably this push-pull factor, increasing trade in palm oil in the 19th century, plus groups of alien people, other Africans, Kru from what is now Liberia, and Sierra Leone Creoles from Sierra Leone, who began to sort of impinge on the Bubi, and the Bubi began to organize politically and also spiritually. There's a kind of Mocha, the king who emerges by 1875, has a great deal of spiritual power. By the 1880s, he was in contact with Catholic missionaries who describe him as having many, many, many wives, having a permanent Mocha lived to be 105 years old. Could be, but I think 2 reigns may have been combined. Now, Mocha sort of is this shadowy figure that who doesn't see foreigners. And finally, in the 1880s, he is seen, not described in great detail. So there isn't a great deal of physical description of him, but there is a lot of talk in Spanish missionary archives about efforts to convince him to become Roman Catholic. And he does accept in the 1880s potatoes, but says, I don't want to accept this foreign religion. So it doesn't, what he does is he says some things, some children can be educated by these missionaries, but I do not wish to be. And he sort of maintained a sort of policy which was trying to avoid. But the Bubi population was declining precipitously. It was 20,000 inhabitants, around 20,000 inhabitants in 1848. At the time of Mocha's death in 1899, there were no more than 14,800 Bubi. And this is probably because of yellow fever in 1868, smallpox in 1889, whooping cough in 1893, and dysentery in 1896. Now, Mocha died in February of 1899, this kind of mythical figure. When he died, Spanish missionaries asked to see his body. The Bubi said no. He's buried in secret. After his death, the Bubi they refused through fighting their labor revolts in 1906 and 1910, where the Bubi refused to become labor from Nigeria is brought in. And Mocha acquires this kind of mythical status. His followers, Malabo, who is king from 1904 to 1937, Alobari 1937-43, and Oriche 1943-52, are sort of not as great. Obviously, they're living under Spanish imperialism. They are prone to rule a population, or they're set up to rule a population which is declining. So by 1945, Spanish anthropologists say the Bubi will become extinct, which doesn't happen. Now back to and I'll be quick, back to my original question, which is Ms. McCullough. You know, I started talking about Ms. McCullough living in Bristol. By the way, you can ask me afterwards, there's a web page that the city council has with her on it, the one woman who found been going on since the book roots in the 1970s, and it's an interesting study of the creation of memory, which is as important as what really happened, I would argue. I'm not saying that's the same thing, but certainly this sort of creation of sort of becoming a blood relative, it's sort of adopting children. All this Ms. McCullough has done, and this has been followed by more and more people, maybe, in Great Britain, saying that they're Bubi. And so that the Bubi who never participated now become statistically rather important. Let's say 20 people say they're Bubi. That's interesting. They say they're Bubi rather than a much larger group like the Kru or the Pele in Liberia. And create a memory, sort of say we go there, we feel Bioko in our blood. And lastly is the question of why people in the diaspora, in the Caribbean, about the accuracy of DNA. Can you really say you were from this people, this village? Can that be done? And on that note, I'll end with just this. We should look at memory. I'm going to interview Ms. McCullough. I'm very excited. She might be right. She may be wrong. But what is really interesting is our quest for noble ancestors, whether we're in Europe or Asia or we're of African descent. Some of you have heard the name Oprah Winfrey. Yes. Well, Oprah Winfrey 3 years ago said she felt in her bones, to her soul, that she was Zulu. Don't laugh, come on. She said it, and she's very rich. And what happened was that this became, she started a school. She has a school. Oprah invested in the Zulu. And then with retesting, because we can retest, or you can have yourself retested. We can't force people to test. It seems that probably Oprah's ancestors came from West Africa, or Goma, or Pele from what is now Liberia. But there won't be any schools probably built in Liberia and the hinterland among the Pele and the Goma. Some groups are much more attractive. And so I'm very happy, and I'll end on this, I'm very happy that if Ms. McCullough had to choose a group to build a school to give money to, I'm glad she found my booby. Thank you.
Good morning, Mbolani. I'm one of the few people here, I suspect, that doesn't speak Spanish. Misakoba Panya, Makoba Falan and Guess Fang Avitsang. I speak Fang a little bit, and I speak French and English. And I'm also not a specialist of Equatorial Guinea, at least not yet, but rather I'm a specialist of the history of colonial Gabon. And today's presentation, of which it's a longer paper, I'm going to just read the first 2 pages and summarize the rest, is dedicated to looking at the different experiences and perspectives of a community of Equatorial Guineans who oftentimes might not receive so much attention as other Guineans, whether in their homeland or in the Americas or in Europe, that being the large community of Guineans living in Gabon, some of whom are my closest say, but rather my experiences living with and meeting and discussing life with Guineans living in Gabon since 1998. And I'd like to begin by describing one particular encounter that might expose some of the challenges that Guineans face in Gabon. In September 2000, a Gabonese landlord in the capital city of Libreville began an argument with a family that had moved there in the mid-1970s. This family had fled Guinea during the horrific period of the 1970s that I'm sure we're all aware of. The landlord berated this family of 5 about the fact that they were continually late in paying rent. Barbara, the 60-year-old matriarch of the family, replied in anger that her Gabonese clients never paid her on time for the Odika sauces and oils that she sold them. You are just Equato. Now, Equato is a short form of, you can guess, Equatorial Guinean, but it's basically the common term in Gabon used for immigrants from Equatorial Guinea. Except for the word Equato, the entire conversation I just described was entirely in Fang, which as a researcher struck me as a particularly interesting moment, as generally the issue of national identity was not commonly raised by anyone within this neighborhood or anyone within this family or any discussions between the landlord and this particular group of people. Barbara and her landlord shared a common language and ethnic identity. However, national identities divided them. In Gabon, immigrants from Equatorial Guinea have long been associated with poverty and crime since their arrival in large numbers. In 1979, the Gabonese government even organized of Benin and people from Cameroon in 1978 and 1981, respectively. Even though some Gabonese have belittled and continue to belittle Guineans as poor and uneducated, the rising fortunes of economic fortunes of Equatorial Guinea, beginning in the 1990s, has changed the complicated relationship between the two countries. Some Guineans have made a very comfortable living in Gabon, particularly those involved in the oil and timber industries. In July 2007, I met Roberto, a Ghanaian timber camp manager working in a Gabonese village located near the central Gabonese town of Boué. For those of you not particularly familiar with Gabon, the vast majority of Ghanaians living in Gabon either live in the northern province of Wolo-Ntem or they live in Libreville. So to run into anyone from Equatorial Guinea in this particular region of Gabon was a shock. However, a much bigger shock was in store when he had brought in expensive foods from France and Spain, and he had the most expensive wardrobe in the entire village. He and his brother, Alex, clearly were the wealthiest people in the town, and they took quite a great deal of pride in their success. And they also kept praising the orderly life of Equatorial Guinea in comparison to what they felt was the chaotic and undisciplined nature of Gabonese society. The lives and viewpoints of Ghanaian immigrants in Gabon deserve attention from anyone seeking to understand historical events in Equatorial Guinea, as well as the perspectives of people in the Equatorial Guinean diaspora. Understandably, Ghanaians in Spain and elsewhere in Europe and the Americas have been the main subject of attention from scholars trying to understand the lives of Ghanaian immigrants. Ghanaians lived in Gabon according to the Gabonese government in the mid-1990s. Cameroon, Gabon, and Nigeria are thus home to many Ghanaians. Their fortunes have changed with the economic boom in their homeland. This presentation will examine changing notions of national identities and immigrant experiences in Ghanaians living in Gabon. It will not investigate in detail the shifting diplomatic relationships between the two countries, particularly over oil rights that both countries claim in the waters in the Bay of Manda. This particular issue, for any of the many Ghanaians that I know and I have met in Gabon in the last 10 years, is not an issue that is ever brought up. The vast majority of Gabonese never bring up the issue of the oil of claims over oil either. That this is seen as mainly an issue between two separate governments rather than the people of the two countries. The main source of this to conclude that the perspectives presented here necessarily represent the majority of Ghanaians living in Gabon. For example, the sizable number of Ghanaians working as hunters, hunting for bushmeat to sell in Libreville and in Port-Gentil in much of Gabon is entirely excluded here, because my fieldwork mainly took place in Libreville, in towns along the Ogooué River in Gabon, and in southern Gabon. Furthermore, the informants presented in this presentation probably do not represent an accurate sample of Ghanaians in regards to social class. This collection of roughly 15 or so individuals mentioned here are in general probably much better off than most Ghanaians living in Gabon, and a majority of them are men rather than women. Thus, the conclusions of this study should only be treated as a very provisional guide to changing opportunities and constructions of Gabonese and Ghanaian national identity. Three sets of informants. The first being Barbara and her family, and I'm not using anyone's real names in this presentation, by the way. A poor family living in Libreville who had come in the night, Barbara, who had basically brought the family over in the 1970s as refugees. I'll compare their perspectives briefly with those of missionaries, Catholic missionaries from Equatorial Guinea, now working in Libreville. And finally, I'll discuss briefly Roberto and Alex, the two brothers who had such a beautiful house in the unnamed village in central Gabon. One thing that is quite striking if one looks at all three sets of narratives is, first off, what they actually have in common. That one major issue, which actually touches on your paper, Enrique, as well, is going to be the issue of self-discipline. Whether it's middle-aged or younger priests, one thing that they highlighted repeatedly to me and certainly to other people, namely Gabonese people, is how they felt that Ghanaians had a much better sense of discipline, of self-control than their Gabonese neighbors. Roberto, for example, told me repeatedly while I was staying in his village over a course of about 2 weeks or so, that he could never marry a Gabonese woman, completely out of the question. And he's basically started talking about they're so promiscuous, they drink all the time, they just want your money. I want a good woman from Guinea, because people in Guinea are disciplined. They're not like these people running around here. Barbara and her family would also bring up this idea of self-discipline as well, that Barbara presented herself as someone who had been very faithful to supporting her family, that although she didn't like to talk about it, her other family members described in loving from Bata all the way to Cocoa Beach in the mid-1970s, how she had basically taken her children by the hand. All three children were under the age of 10, how she had escaped government patrols, whether on the Ghanaian side of the border, whether on the Gabonese side of the border. And then the family would continually complain how you couldn't rely on Gabonese people. That, for example, Barbara was a peddler, that she sold Odika sauce, lots of different kinds of products that she would produce herself, and invariably have to wait for her Gabonese clients to pay for the money, which they never paid on time, which eventually mean that she couldn't pay the rent. Catholic priests, though this is kind of an interesting generational difference, in other ways, which I'll get to in a minute, one thing that they kept in mind, that they kept repeating to me and to other Gabonese people, is that there were too many social problems associated with disorder, and particularly young people in Libreville. Not knowing how to truly suffer for their faith. This oftentimes was consciously alluded to in comparisons what had happened with the church in Equatorial Guinea during the 1970s, which had faced a tremendous amount of oppression from the government. That, particularly for some of the younger priests, they would basically say that Gabonese people are basically spoiled. They've had it easy here. They don't know what it's like to be martyrs for their faith. And that one priest went so far as to argue that the present president of Equatorial Guinea was someone who supported the church. That in Father Gabriel's words, you always know that when he will attend masses. That he's somebody who is going to have to listen to what we as priests have to say. Now, this might seem a bit of an odd in regards to what had happened in the 70s. And that, at least for some of these missionaries, there's a sense that we have built this self-control, we've gone through this crucible of suffering, and now that we are better for it, whereas these Gabonese people don't really have it. Older priests might voice some of these same issues, but they tended to be more hesitant in terms of discussing issues related to contemporary politics in Equatorial Guinea, or making comparisons between Equatorial Guinea and Gabon. One potential reason for that is the head priest at this one parish is the brother of one of the leading opposition politicians from Equatorial Guinea, now living in exile, and that would probably make sense that he would probably tone some of this down. Another issue related to this idea of taking pride in self-discipline is to make comparisons between the generosity of Equatorial Guineans as opposed to their Gabonese hosts. They're not the living in Gabon will oftentimes say, well, these Gabonese people will just simply harass us because we're immigrants, that they don't, if you were in our country, we would be very generous to you. Barbara and her family was oftentimes talk about, well, you know, these Gabonese people, if you stayed with them, they would just be taking your money. But we're going to actually take care of you, not just for the money, but because we're actually concerned about you. Roberto and his brother actually voiced the same set of concerns. When I joked with him that it seemed like some people from Gabon were now immigrating to Equatorial Guinea for jobs, which, if you're familiar with Gabon, was completely inconceivable until the last 10 years or so. His response was, well, we'll take care of them just as we would take care of Americans. Again, we're not like these Gabonese people, that we're generous, we're open-hearted. These people are much more conniving. Keep in mind, a lot of these critiques of Gabonese society will oftentimes be voiced by Gabonese people themselves, particularly middle-aged people. Benefits of that period, but also that somehow Gabon was more disciplined, that Gabonese people under a one-party regime had resisted the temptations of wealth much more effectively than the present. Another point I'd like to make in terms of making comparisons between these different perspectives is how a lot of issues commonly voiced about Equatorial Guinea's past and present do not come up in their narratives regarding Equatorial Guinean identity. That none of the groups that I've mentioned particularly wanted to discuss major political issues, and that they didn't, in some cases, they didn't seem particularly informed about them. And that might seem as a bit of a surprise, and maybe just simply because, as a foreign observer, that's going to have an impact on what people would say to me. But the time that really shapes historical memory of Equatorial Guinea for the majority of refugees living in Gabon, for the majority of immigrants who had come during that period. Although some immigrants are coming thereafter and they're not as tied to this traumatic period, thank you, at least for the people who would come in the 1970s, literally anything is seen as better than the 1970s. That would help explain, for example, Barbara's nostalgia for the 1960s and colonial rule. That, for example, during the World Cup, she watched avidly all games that Spain played in, and she would cheer "Viva España" all the time and start yelling, "I'm Spanish, I'm Spanish, I'm Spanish. I'm not from Guinea, I'm not from Gabon." She, in fact, refused to get a Equatorial Guinean ID card, and so the only ID nor Ghanaian, but she identified herself with Spain. Her children kind of laughed about this, that they had basically, they now identified themselves as being Gabonese rather than from Guinea. And that sense of nostalgia would be voiced by other older Equatorial Guinean immigrants as well, that the 1960s is presented as actually was a very prosperous time, and even some elderly Gabonese people who had lived in Bata in the 60s would oftentimes say, well, Bata had all the stuff. You could get all the merchandise you wanted there, the prices were much lower, and that if you were in Libreville, the duties were higher. So if you, for a lot of goods, people would actually travel to Guinea, buy them, and then return to Gabon and sell them. What I'm suggesting in this short and very provisional presentation is that if we're going to look at the history of Equatorial Guinea in the late 20th century, we need to take in mind that as certainly from independence to the present, that you have to also take into account alternative opinions, particularly from people who oftentimes do not have the opportunity to voice their ideas and their perspectives in settings in North America and in Europe. With that, I thank you very much.
Okay, before starting my presentation, I would like to thank Benita, Hofstra University, wonderful conference. I'm going to talk about the relationship between the two neighbors, Santo Domingo and Principe and Equatorial Guinea, and also about the relationship or the developing relationship between the community of Portuguese-speaking countries, CPLP, and Equatorial Guinea. The two countries, they are quite different by history, by culture, but also by political culture, and certainly also by the political regime. Santo Domingo and Principe is a Creole society. They it's a peaceful society. There is no tradition of political violence, and it's a semi-presidential political regime, which means the head of state is not the head of government, which is quite unique for political systems. That's a working democracy with a high degree of political and civil liberties, freedoms for the citizens. Okay, having it's also that being neighbors, these two countries, they're quite close to each other. They have never developed a close relationship, not economically, not politically, not culturally. Over most time, there have not been regular air or sea links from Santo Domingo and Principe with this country, Equatorial Guinea. While, for example, Santo Domingo and Principe, they maintain regular links with Angola, now also with Nigeria, with Gabon, with Cape Verde, and certainly with Portugal, but not with this close neighbor. It's only very 2007 that these countries have developed closer relationships, particularly through the two heads of state. As we have already heard, the four islands, only Santo Domingo and Principe, they were effectively colonized by the Portuguese, but not Bioko and Anobong, only to a very small extent. But it's quite interesting that when the Spanish formally took over in 1778, and when the British came to establish Clarence in 1827, they both found communities of escaped slaves, runaway slaves in the south of Bioko, which means that slaves from Santo Domingo, and later after the abolition of slavery also possibly particularly from Principe, because it's closer, have succeeded in coming by the sea currents, by Cano to Bioko, and formed there a small community. And there are reports from these two occasions about this. It's also interesting that at the end of the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, there was also a small-scale immigration, both from Equatorial Guineans, which means people from Bioko, Creoles from Bioko to Santo Domingo, but also from Santomians to Fenaupo, Bioko, who both engaged in agriculture. And possibly just before or during the Second World War, there was also a larger scale, not large scale, but a larger scale in Bioko, in the capital. They're mostly engaged in small trade, but also in the administration, worked in the administrations, and worked on the plantations, mostly also as foremen. And there was a considerable immigrant community in the 60s of the last century in Bioko. These people, they had a status that was higher than the natives of Equatorial Guinea because they were considered Portuguese and they were on the same levels as the assimilados and the Spanish. And this was also due to this existing community that in the 70s, the liberation movement of Santo Tomé and Príncipe was established in Santa Isabel, which is now Malabo, because this host country. But when they don't, well, they didn't really engage in the political struggle in Santo Tomé because this was not possible because the Portuguese were in control in the archipelago. But when the Portuguese revolution took place in April 74, there was the political space to struggle for complete independence in Santo Tomé. But then these people, they quickly moved to Libreville and started this political struggle from Libreville, these Santo Tomeans. And it was also in the, I think possibly in the late 70s, when conditions in Bioko became very difficult, harassing of the local Santo Tomean community. Many of them, they left, they were forced to leave. Some of them, they were evacuated by the Spanish, they came to the Canada. Difficult situation, but nevertheless, a few also stayed. And the community is still existing. It's small, but it's still existing. And it was in '82 when there was also a very difficult situation in Santo Tomé. At that time, a socialist one-party state. That the president of Santo Tomé, Pinto da Costa, here at the time, he came to Malabo and signed with the new president, Teodoro Obiang, various agreements on trade, air links, sea links, and of friendship. But in fact, very little was really done because at the time, I think both countries, there was little what they really could offer each other, and very little was really implemented and done. There was only the treaty, but almost nothing really happened. And it was only after 17. That they negotiated the maritime borders with the neighboring countries, Gabon, Nigeria, and Equatorial Guinea. And it was at that time that in '99 they signed both countries border agreement. But again, there was no development in the bilateral relationships. It was only from 2004 when the actual president, Fradique de Menezes, paid a visit to Malabo that the relationship developed further. At the time, he invited President Obiang as a guest of honor to the summit of the CPLP in the same year that took place in Sao Tome and Príncipe. And I can't there was an ambassador of Equatorial Guinea in Libreville who was also accredited in Santo Tomé, but there was no resident ambassador of the country in Santo Tomé. This only happened in 2006. And also, I think, related to the coup attempts that took place in 2003 and 2004, respectively, in the two countries, they signed a bilateral security agreement, also in 2005, also to protect the oil deposits and of the two countries is one of the parts of the agreements, but also against smuggling, etc. And as I said before, it was only, I think, from 2007 that we can say that a closer relationship of the two countries has started to develop. Santomean president, Rethinking maintained some kind of special personal relationship. So let's say it was the closest, or one of the closest friends in the region. And Menezes never, at least until now, succeeded in maintaining or developing a similar relationships with the successor in the Nigerian presidency. But I think it was since then that he engaged and succeeded in developing a closer relationship with Teodoro Obiang in Malabo, because since then there were increasing visits. He also, Fradike de Menezes, asked for development aid when there were special needs. For example, at the end of 2007, they asked etc. So there was some real aid, quick aid, easy aid that came from Equatorial Guinea to Santomé. And there was also formally in 2008, the two countries signed a general agreement on cooperation, which is in agriculture, oil, forestry, in education, etc. And what is also interesting, if when Obiang came to San Tomé in December last year, that he also brought some people from the leadership of his own party that signed a party agreement with the party that is close to President Menezes. And these parties in Equatorial Guinea, they, together with their partners, they won the elections last year with 99%, while this party of Rethinking first is only one of the four parties presented in parliament, and they do not represent more than maybe 15% of the votes. And it's only a minor partner in the government. And it's also a little bit delicate because according to the semi-presidential system, which obliges the president, the head of state, to be above the parties, not to engage in everyday politics, it's officially he can't be the chairman, the leader of a party. So he says, I'm the virtual leader of this party, and there are other people. They signed this agreement, and people in Sao Tome think that this is also in the first place in terms of financing. So parties in Sao Tome, they're usually in a poor country. They don't have financing for campaigns, for campaigning, for the party work. So I think in the first instance, this relationship has to do with financing that the Santomeans are seeking in the oil-rich neighboring country. Compared with the Nigerians or the Angolans, there are almost no investments, economic private investments in Sao Tome. There was one big agreement that was signed in 2007 worth $1 billion. It was said that Equatorial Guinea company called Obras would on principle. They preferred the year later, in last year, to sign another contract with a Dutch investor. So there won't be Equatorial Guinean investment on the island of Principe. And a former minister, he told me that there's no airport at all, but possibly the Guineans, the Equatorial Guineans, would construct a seaport on the island of San Tome. At least this is right now the idea or what they have agreed, the two parties. As I said, that over the whole time, there were only occasional air links. There has never been a regular air link or sea link, certainly not in the post. Between Saint-Thomé and Malabo. But this also was discontinued after a short period of time, reportedly because they said in Saint-Thomé that the Equatorial Guineans did not agree to the days scheduled for this air link. I think they were offered Fridays and Saturdays, but they didn't agree, and the Saint-Thomeans, the Saint-Thomeans, they didn't offer Saturday and Friday as they wanted, because there were other companies from Europe and from Angola using these days. So there was no possibility. And then I think they pulled out or suspended this flight connection, possibly until now. There was also another development. A few dozens of people, they were hired also by foreign employers, Italian employers, etc. And some, they went there, and of course, these are job opportunities they won't find in Saint-Thomé. There were also some problems because due to particular reasons, there was one case that there were 50 people, they forced the employer to repatriate them to Saint-Thomé because they were only paid a third of their salaries that was promised at the time. So they even seized the plane when the plane returned them to Saint-Thomé, and they forced the Saint-Thomean government to interfere in this case, and I think later they were paid. But anyway, there were problems, and until now, do this new relationship between Equatorial Guinea and the CPLP, the Community of Portuguese-Speaking Countries. This community was established in 1906 by Portugal, Brazil, and the other former Portuguese colonies, 5 in Africa, and in 2002, after independence, also East Timor joined the community, the 8-country community. And this community, in fact, has not a political project. It's first, and in the first place, it's a cultural project, it's a language project. The common denominator of this community is very much the language. So as I told you, summit, the 5th summit of this community is a biannual summit in Saint-Thomé. And at this summit, first he had the opportunity to meet all these other heads of states and governments of these other countries at the time. And he also declared the intention of his country, of his regime, to become a member of the CPLP, to become the 9th member of the CPLP. And this was agreed by the community, and the community, they even created the status of associated observer country that had not existed before. And it was in 2006 that Equatorial Guinea was formally admitted as the associated observer of the CPLP, at the time together with Mauritius. And the year afterwards, for the first time, they participated. This is the second highest meeting of the community. It's an annual meeting of the foreign ministers of these countries. And at the last summit in Lisbon, also the president of Equatorial Guinea, he personally participated in these summits, and also to underline again the intention of his country to become a full member state. Equatorial Guinea has announced to introduce Portuguese after Spanish and French. This was in '98, to introduce Portuguese as third official language to meet the requirements of the community. There are intentions to develop Portuguese as language of instruction, and it's interesting that this in the country nobody speaks, but it seems it is taken seriously by some member countries of the CPLP, at least by some of these leaderships. There have already been signed agreements with Portugal of the projects to promote Portuguese language courses in the country. So the question if Equatorial Guinea really will be admitted as the 9th member state at the next summit in 2010. And I think it's possible because there are interests, of course, since the last years, all these member states, they have also financial needs of Cape Verde, of Guinea-Bissau, of São Tomé to benefit from the oil wealth of this country. So it's possible, but it's a little bit, it's a dilemma because it always will remain artificial if a community that advocates the official language as the common denominator admits a country where this is artificially, superficially created. And the other problem is also that, at least on paper, the CPLP, they defend political projects, democracy, good government, etc., that at least for the time being have not been met by these possible new member states. So this is, I think for the time being, it's an full member will be fulfilled. And I think possibly the interest of Equatorial Guinea is to improve its international image, to diversify its international relationships and economic relationships with these countries. And possibly also the other project to become a member of the French community have not very much been succeeded. So they now try to become a member of the Lusophone country community, also because it is said, at least at the CPLP, they say, okay, the Equatorial Guinea is the only Spanish-speaking country in Africa. They don't have a home. It's not Anglophone, it's not Francophone, but it's very close, and I say for historical reasons, but we have already heard that there is not much shared Guinea. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you for those 4 impressive presentations. We'll now begin what is a 15-minute question and answer period. And in the spirit of an academic Q&A, if you could state your questions clearly and precisely, and address them to the particular scholar when possible. We also ask that you use the microphone in the center aisle in the middle of the room so that everybody in the auditorium can hear that particular question. And if you guys could turn on your microphone so you can respond. The microphone, please.
Hello, hello. Yes, I thank you very much. But although I can speak some English, but I prefer to use the language I monitor better, this in Spanish. Y voy a ser muy breve. Quiero agradecer al joven Okembe, que considero un hijo. Su país, que supongo. Pero quizás tenga algunos puntos que aclararle, porque le he visto un tanto impetuoso en su exposición. Y yo no sé cuándo estuvo por última vez en Guinea, y no sé en qué se basa o se fundamenta su análisis el que acaba de hacernos, pero le diré que yo fui secretario general del Partido Democrático de Guinea Ecuatorial durante 7 años, el que más tiempo ha estado. Y el Partido Democrático de Guinea Ecuatorial no es un partido de coacción ni de imposición de ideología. Y si un partido...
Excuse me, sir. It's not an open forum. So please, if you have a question for Mr. Okembe, please ask it.
Yeah, but when you introduced the question, you said that they may
But we only have 15
question
we only have
and answers.
Sir, we only have
That's what you
15
said.
minutes. Please. We only have 15 minutes. And if you go on for 15 minutes, then there are no questions.
Okay. Entonces, primero mi pregunta es ¿cuándo estuvo por última vez en Guinea? Y yo creo que sus aseveraciones las hemos escuchado muchas veces. Las hemos escuchado muchas veces y yo creo que se basan más en lo que oye, lo que dice la gente, lo que deja de decir, y creo que no conoce realmente la realidad profunda de Guinea Ecuatorial. Entonces, usted habla de clientelismo. El exdirigente de MAIP, Buenaventura Julián Bococo, que se hizo llamar Bualalele, es ahora miembro de la Corte Suprema de Justicia en Guinea Ecuatorial. Entonces yo quiero saber en qué se basa el clientelismo que usted ha enunciado, y yo hubiera seguido más, pero claro, porque hubiera querido hacer unas puntualizaciones que quizás nos hubieran llevado quizás a más aclaración, a más luz sobre la situación real de Guinea Ecuatorial, que veo que no está bien representada, no está bien entendida afuera. Muchas gracias.
Sí, respecto a la última vez que estuve en Guinea, fue este verano, el verano pasado, o sea que no hace subjetivo. Es decir, las condiciones políticas y sociales no se dan en Guinea para hacer un estudio serio. No es posible hacer una encuesta, salir a la calle a hacer encuestas de qué es lo que el guineano de a pie piensa sobre la situación en el país. Entonces, la única alternativa es un poco fundamentarse en tus experiencias diarias con la gente y tratar de eso sacar conclusiones. Estas son las bases de mi sobre las que baso este análisis. Una cosa que sí quería decir es que, a diferencia de otros, mi intención aquí es lanzar un análisis sobre la situación, pero este análisis no es para sentar cátedra. Cada uno puede discurso, cada uno decir lo que opinamos y ya está.
No, quiero, pero al profesor siguiente. Sí, entonces, Simplemente, hombre, como no hay que hacer ningún comentario de precisión, simplemente, hombre, felicitar al joven Okenve, que bueno, que ha hecho un poco el análisis de lo que es neocolonialismo en Guinea Ecuatorial, nada más. Yo no quiero, si quieren, pues hablamos del tema. En cuanto al profesor, en cuanto al profesor Ibrahim, sí, profesor, o sea, una brillante posición en lo que es el bullion. Yo tampoco quiero hacer la teoría de podemos hablar de checa anterior. Solo decirle, no sé si tiene la nota del rey Sasebuera, que cuando muere Moca, Sasebuera es radical, entonces sucede a Bioko por medio de, pues mira, entonces promulga un decreto que lleva pues a prohibir a los nativos, bueno, su contrato con los colonos. Y posteriormente, pues, bueno, cuando muere Sasebuera ya le sucede pues el Malabo. No sé si usted tiene esa referencia. En cuanto al profesor, a ver, es Jeremy, parece que, hombre, el análisis que ha hecho usted de la relación entre las poblaciones gabonesas y después la de Guinea Ecuatorial, yo en principio, yo quería sugerirle, si es posible, ¿verdad? Es decir, que esos análisis son, vamos, habría que compararles un poquitín más. No sé hasta qué punto lo ha hecho desde el punto de vista cultural, porque son las mismas culturas. Yo mismo he nacido en Guinea, mi padre en Gabón, que había matrimonios, todo mixto por todos lados. Pero ahora, me parecería extraño, bueno, esa nota que ha dicho usted que ese punto. Gracias.
Gracias por su intervención. Y sí, yo tengo notas sobre Sasebuera antes de Malabo, porque él fue mucho más fuerte en su posición contra los españoles. E infelizmente fue derrotado, pero él y Moca no fueron exactamente al mismo línea. Moca fue mucho más diplomático que Sasebuera, que fue de punto fundamental contra los españoles. Quiero decir solamente una cosa. Tal vez en el futuro Bioko puede ser un lugar, un sitio de turismo de raíces. Y es un tema que yo no puedo entrar en este momento, pero Gambia, Ghana y exterior. Es muy interesante porque 3 personas ahora están escribiendo sobre la creación de memoria en Ghana, Gambia y Senegal. Y tal vez, quién sabe, tal vez también en Guinea Ecuatorial.
No hablo español. Mañana cobengues. Okay. I think you're absolutely right that there are many that certainly there's many different examples of how Gabonese people and Equatorial Guinean people have intermarried with one another. They share a great deal, particularly for Fong speakers naturally. They share a great deal of cultural institutions as well as their language. And I would actually argue that in terms of one sense of discipline and constructions of masculinity among Fong-speaking people, whether in Cameroon or Equatorial Guinea or Gabon, in my discussion was that national identities and tensions between national identities are strategically used. They do not come up all of the time, and particularly for Gabonese people and people from Equatorial Guinea who are competing for limited access to the wealth of, certainly in Gabon, and job opportunities, that they oftentimes come up in terms of financial difficulties. For example, when I mentioned at the beginning Barbara's problem with her landlord, everyone's speaking in Fong. People had never talked about national identities, but when they started to argue about money, suddenly there's a distinction. There's complaints that come out. Just as you can see when you take a taxi in Libreville, Gabonese people, when they start complaining about these foreigners, it's complaining about foreign taxi drivers. They may very well be married to someone from Equatorial Guinea or from West Africa, but in certain strategic moments, they're going to try to play this nationalism card. So you're absolutely
Quería al profesor Gerhard Seibert que cómo es posible hablar de lusofonía, francofonía entre Santo Tomé y Príncipe y Malabo, como capital, o Guinea Ecuatorial, sin pasar por Annobón. Me extraña enormemente. Nada más.
É verdade que todo mundo sabe, pelo menos aqui na sala, que há uma história portuguesa da ilha de Annobón. Mas a questão é se isso justifica de falar de uma história do próprio país com ter tido durante muito tempo laços estreitos entre Portugal ou o mundo lusófono. É dos crioulos falados no Golfo da Guiné e é como os outros três, é da base lexical portuguesa. Ninguém contesta isso, mas a questão é se isso justifica de considerar país de língua oficial da colonização espanhola país lusófono. Esta é a questão, acho. Obrigado pela sua questão.
We have time for one more question, please. You asked a long time ago, please. Sir, second row, please. Go ahead, please.
Quería puntualizar una cosa. En Occidente, cuando uno forma parte de una organización, generalmente aparece en la lista o en el libro de registro de socios o miembros de esa organización. Generalmente en Guinea Ecuatorial, los guineoecuatorianos o los políticos Agustín Zenfumu, que dice el antiguo dirigente del MAIP, Buelalele, que yo, no me consta que Buelalele haya sido nunca miembro del MAIP, porque no hay ninguna lista de personas que estén afiliadas al MAIP. En segundo lugar, para el profesor Ibrahima, hay una cuestión, los bubis, los más viejos, es decir, 103, 105 años, nos cuentan hoy día lo que vivieron, lo que les contaron sus mayores cuando vivía Sas Ebuera, ¿no? Y evidentemente yo me he dedicado a ese estudio y he recogido de alguna manera lo que dicen de este gran personaje nuestro, ¿no? Sas Ebuera. Y me gustaría que pues profundizara más y cuando habla del rise and fall of the Bubi policy también hablara mucho de este Sas. No tiene nada que ver con Malabo, ¿no?
En mi ponencia yo tengo un poco más sobre Sasabuera, porque mis fuentes dicen que Malabo, que hoy en día es el nombre de la capital, fue un títere, pero de los españoles. Sasabuera fue una persona importante, impresionante, pero al mismo tiempo el pueblo se quedó en declenio en los años 90 del siglo XIX. Y fue casi imposible expulsar a los críos de Sierra Leona o de los españoles. Y en mi discurso, en mi papel, ¿okay? Yo tengo ese conflicto entre un diplomata como patatas o papas. Ustedes pueden cultivar esto, pero no las almas de los niños. Y Sastuebu era mucho más fuerte, diciendo que no quiero nada del exterior. Pero yo creo que fue imposible en ese momento de tiempo al final del siglo XIX. Yo creo que el imperialismo fue tan fuerte que fue casi imposible por Bioko resistir. Yo creo esto.
That concludes our session.